I thought I found a skilled worker, but it was a young woman sleeping on the street. She had nowhere else to go, no job, no money. She was too ashamed to ask her family for help. I had only 5 yuan, just enough to buy her instant noodles. This is the reality for many. Sleeping rough, surviving on scraps, and clinging to dignity. Sometimes I feel that for us poor people, life is utterly meaningless. Each day is just a monotonous loop. Work, rest briefly, then back to work. Weekends off, that's a fantasy. It's as if our existence is solely to labor endlessly, without respite. Jobs are so scarce that even factories can't find workers. People would rather sleep on the streets than endure the exploitation inside. The so-called great opportunities are just illusions. Even internet cafes offer more solace than the oppressive work environments. We were told that hard work leads to success. But the reality is, the harder we work, the deeper we sink into poverty. Those who labor from dawn till dusk, who sacrifice their health and youth, are rewarded with debt, exhaustion, and despair. The system is rigged against us. Young people are criticized for lying flat, for giving up. But what choice do they have? The promises of prosperity are hollow. Education leads to unemployment. Ambition leads to burnout. In a society where effort is punished and compliance is exploited, resignation becomes a form of resistance.
China's economic stagnation, the ripple effects of a housing crisis. China's economy is grappling with a persistent housing crisis that reverberates across multiple sectors, dragging down growth and exposing deep-seated structural flaws. A striking example of this malaise is a sprawling, multi-billion yuan expressway, half-built and left to decay, standing as a stark metaphor for an economic system faltering under its own weight. The Chinese economy is not just slowing. It faces the risk of a prolonged downturn, with roots in a complex interplay of low consumer spending, a colossal debt burden, and a real estate bubble threatening to burst. At the heart of these issues lies a cultural and systemic preference for saving over spending, compounded by government policies that have misallocated resources for decades. The spending problem, a cultural and economic divide. In China, household consumption accounts for less than 40% of GDP, a stark contrast to the United States, where it constitutes roughly 70%. This low spending rate leaves China heavily reliant on exports, government expenditure, and investment, three pillars that are increasingly unstable. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has resorted to desperate measures, such as subsidizing household appliances like refrigerators and washing machines to spur spending, but these efforts have largely failed. Beneath the surface, a $10 trillion zero-cents debt crisis, an overheated property market, and an economic model built on shaky foundations loom large, threatening a collapse that the CCP is ill-prepared to manage. The core issue driving China's economic woes is the reluctance of its citizens to spend. For every 100 yuan earned, Chinese households save an average of 32 yuan, resulting in a household savings rate of 32%. Total household savings have soared to 140 trillion yuan, or approximately $19 trillion USD, an amount exceeding China's annual GDP. This is in sharp contrast to the US, where the household savings rate hovers around 4%, meaning only $4.00 of every $100.00 earned is saved. In the U.S., robust consumer spending fuels demand, driving economic growth and enabling the country to account for a third of global consumption, despite having just 4% of the world's population. China's inability to replicate this model stems from a combination of historical trauma, cultural norms, and systemic inefficiencies. Historical roots of high savings. China's high savings rate is deeply rooted in its history of hardship. The 20th century was marked by recurring famines, with 7 major episodes that left millions dead. The most devastating was Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, Forward 5961, which led to an estimated 15 to 55 million deaths due to starvation and economic mismanagement. During this period, the state confiscated private assets with little regard for citizens, eroding trust in the system. For older generations, these memories linger, fostering a belief that saving is essential for survival. Confucian teachings, which emphasize frugality and restraint, further reinforce this mindset. A well-known saying attributed to Confucius advises, "When prosperity comes, do not exhaust it," a principle that resonates in a nation where prosperity is a relatively recent phenomenon. Economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s opened China's economy, leading to unprecedented growth over the past 3 decades. However, the scars of past crises have left many skeptical of the system's stability. Even younger generations born during this period of relative prosperity exhibit high savings rates. This is partly because social status in China is closely tied to wealth, particularly property ownership. Owning a home in a major city like Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen is seen as the pinnacle of financial success, and owning multiple properties elevates one's status further. Cultural norms also dictate that men must own a home before marriage, a requirement that renting cannot fulfill. However, skyrocketing property prices, 50 times the average annual income in Shanghai and over 30 times in cities like Shenzhen and Beijing, make homeownership unattainable for many without years of disciplined saving. Weak social safety nets and the savings imperative. China's inadequate social safety nets further incentivize saving. Despite the CCP's socialist rhetoric, public services like pensions and healthcare are woefully underfunded. The urban pension system, which covers only a fraction of the population, provides a monthly payout of about $460, insufficient to cover living costs in cities. For 2/3 of Chinese citizens, primarily those in rural areas, pensions are a meager $25 per month or less. With the pension system projected to deplete its funds by 2035 due to an aging population, workers face the prospect of higher taxes and reduced benefits. This looming crisis compels individuals to save aggressively for retirement from a young age. Healthcare access is similarly problematic. While 96% of Chinese citizens are enrolled in the National Health Insurance Program, coverage is uneven. Urban residents benefit from relatively well-paid public hospitals, but rural and smaller city residents often rely on substandard facilities or expensive private hospitals where costs are paid out of pocket. In rural areas, home to roughly 40% of China's population, over 500 million people, access to quality health care is limited, leading many to avoid medical care altogether. Even in urban hospitals, a pay-first, claim-later policy requires upfront payments, and insurance claims are frequently denied, forcing individuals to maintain substantial savings as a buffer against medical emergencies. The housing crisis and declining consumer confidence. The housing crisis has exacerbated these issues, further eroding consumer confidence. Since 2022, confidence has plummeted to historic lows, driven by a troubled job market with youth unemployment in the double digits and overall unemployment rising rapidly. Falling property prices, which have reverted to 2017 levels, have wiped out significant portions of household wealth, as real estate is a primary store of value for many Chinese families. In times of economic uncertainty, people tend to save more, a trend observed globally. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021, the U.S. savings rate spiked to 32% as households braced for uncertainty. However, while U.S. consumer confidence has since rebounded, China's has remained stubbornly low for 3 years, reflecting broader systemic issues in the housing market, state-owned enterprises, and government policy. Inefficient investment and a broken capital market. China's capital markets are another source of economic dysfunction. In the USA, savings can generate substantial returns through investments in stocks, with over 60% of Americans owning equities, often through retirement accounts like 401ks or IRAs. Over time, these investments benefit from compound growth, with average annual returns of around 10%. In contrast, China's stock market, represented by indices like the SSE Composite, has shown minimal long-term growth and high volatility, discouraging investment. Only 16% of Chinese citizens, about 220 million people, invest in stocks. with most preferring safer options like bank deposits, gold, or real estate. However, these alternatives offer low returns. Bank savings accounts yield just 1.5% annually, requiring Chinese households to save far more to achieve the same financial security as their American counterparts. For example, the average Chinese citizen has an annual disposable income of approximately 41,000 yuan, $5,700.00, of which 32%, about $1,800.00, or $150.00 per month, is saved. At a 1.5% annual interest rate, saving $150.00 monthly for 30 years yields less than $70,000.00. In the U.S., the same monthly savings invested in stocks at a 10% annual return would grow to nearly $300,000.00 over the same period, thanks to compound interest. This disparity explains why Chinese households save so much more than their American counterparts, yet achieve comparable financial outcomes. The inefficiency of China's capital markets stems from state intervention. The CCP sets annual GDP growth targets, 5% for 2025, consistent with previous years, and directs investment into strategic sectors like electric vehicles and semiconductors. China's four largest banks, all state-controlled and among the world's biggest, hold assets ranging from $4.6 trillion to $6.3 trillion. These banks channel household savings into loans for real estate, infrastructure, and manufacturing, often at the behest of the CCP. A significant portion of these loans goes to state-owned enterprises, SOEs, which account for 25% of China's economy. These entities prioritize projects that boost short-term GDP figures over long-term financial viability, leading to widespread inefficiency. The real estate bubble, a ticking time bomb. The real estate sector, valued at $130 trillion, 0 cents, is the most glaring example of this misallocation. At its peak, it accounted for 1/5 of China's GDP, fueled by local governments' aggressive push for development to meet growth targets. Property developers, often heavily indebted, were allowed to sell homes before construction, leading to an oversupply of housing. Estimates suggest China has built enough homes to accommodate 3 billion people, more than twice its official population of 1.4 billion, which is likely inflated. The collapse of major developers like Evergrande in 2021, followed by others like Country Garden, exposed the fragility of this model. As trust in the sector evaporated, banks faced the risk of massive loan defaults, threatening a systemic crisis. To mitigate the fallout, the CCP has spent $280 billion, 0 cents annually, to purchase excess properties, adding to an already ballooning government debt. This intervention has prevented an immediate collapse but is unsustainable, potentially adding trillions to the national debt. Infrastructure spending has followed a similar pattern. Over the past 15 years, China has constructed 75,000 miles of highways, 400,000 bridges, and 40,000 miles of railways, costing hundreds of billions. While these projects create the appearance of prosperity, many are underutilized. Empty train stations and unprofitable railways highlight the inefficiency of building for GDP growth rather than actual demand. Export dependency and manufacturing overreach. China's manufacturing sector, another economic pillar, is equally misaligned. State subsidies and cheap loans have fueled overproduction in industries like steel, where China produces over half the world's supply. This export-driven model has created a trade surplus with $3.6 trillion, 0 cents in goods exported in 2024, equivalent to 20% of GDP. However, this dependency makes China vulnerable to external shocks. Countries like India and Vietnam are increasingly competing for manufacturing market share, and importing nations are wary of relying on an authoritarian regime. Declining exports, as seen in recent years, threaten millions of jobs, with 16 million directly tied to U.S. exports alone. Overproduction is rampant in textiles, 20 billion pieces annually, household appliances, 4.5 billion units, electronics, 1.7 billion phones, 340 million laptops, and renewable energy products like solar panels, where China produces nearly double its domestic needs. Without robust domestic consumption to absorb this output, China's economy remains precariously balanced on exports. The debt crisis, a looming threat. China's debt levels are among the highest globally, with total non-financial debt, household, corporate, and government, at 312% of GDP. Government debt alone reached 88% of GDP in 2024 and is projected to hit 100% by 2026 due to persistent deficits. Local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, used to circumvent borrowing restrictions have amassed up to $10 trillion, 0 cents, in debt, over half of GDP. Corporate debt, at 160% of GDP, is double that of the U.S., in relative terms, with SOEs holding a disproportionate share. Many of these entities, particularly in real estate and construction, are unprofitable, surviving only through state bailouts and low-interest loans. This debt-fueled model risks a deflationary spiral, where low consumer spending leads to falling prices, reducing corporate revenues and increasing default risks. Such a spiral could devastate banks, wipe out savings, and further suppress spending, trapping the economy in a vicious cycle. Historical precedents, like the U.S. Great Depression and Japan's lost decade, illustrate the dangers. Since 2023, stagnant consumer prices and declining manufacturing prices signal that China is teetering on the edge of such a crisis. The CCP's response: short-term fixes, long-term risks. To avert disaster, the CCP has lowered interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending, while printing money to cover deficits of 8–9% of GDP. These measures have delayed a full-blown crisis, but at the cost of ballooning debt. The fundamental issue, low consumer spending, remains unaddressed. Only 60% of China's GDP goes to household disposable income, compared to 77% in the U.S. Official GDP per capita is $12,600, 0 cents, but average disposable income is just $5,700, 0 cents. Low wages, driven by the CCP's prioritization of cheap labor for exports and state-controlled enterprises, limit households' ability to spend. The path forward: the need for structural reform. The solution lies in dismantling the state's grip on the economy, reducing the dominance of SOEs, privatizing major banks, and abandoning centrally planned GDP targets would allow capital to flow to efficient, market-driven enterprises. Higher wages and a stronger social safety net would boost consumer spending, reducing reliance on exports and debt-fueled investment. A freer market would also enable households to invest savings in high-return assets, fostering wealth creation and economic resilience. However, the CCP is unlikely to relinquish control. Its obsession with maintaining power and projecting prosperity through inflated GDP figures overrides economic rationality. By continuing to prop up failing enterprises and fund unprofitable projects, the CCP is merely postponing an inevitable reckoning without addressing the root causes: low spending, inefficient investment, and excessive debt. China's economy risks a prolonged decline, with far-reaching consequences for its citizens and the global economy.